NetScout presents On Guard, insights and solutions surrounding the most complex problems of our connected world, from those who help protect it.
Hello and welcome to NetScout's On Guard. My name is Tom Benkowski. I'm a Director of Product Marketing here with NetScout. And joining me today are two individuals, Mark Doring, he's the Director of our Technical Marketing at NetScout, and Hardik Modi. He's the AVP of Threat Intelligence and Mitigation Products. Today we're going to talk to you about some of the lessons learned during the pandemic and how our customers increasingly use network-derived data for cybersecurity purposes or use cases. So without further ado, let's kick it off. So let's talk about the pandemic. We're sort of out of the pandemic at this point. And let's talk about how our customers were impacted, both from a networking or an application or cybersecurity perspective. And let's start with you, Hardik. Tell us a little bit about what our customers experienced.
No, you bet, Tom. So yeah, I'm not the first to say this, but digital transformation came fast at all of us. And so it's March of 2020, and all of a sudden, all of our employees are working remote. So much of our lives were being played out online, and that through to this day now in July of 2021, there's many aspects of this that have continued. Certainly. So just you think about the nature of the enterprise. Yes, you go from having employees often coming into a building and you have closed networks to where everyone is on a VPN. All of your services are now suddenly, whether they're internal or external, are operating at a completely different level, both in terms of performance, but also just the sheer necessity of those services, certainly amped up, many, many degrees. And then just from a security standpoint, so, maintaining the availability, the integrity, the confidentiality of all of these services and the information associated with it, became that much harder to ensure. And I'll tell you that through many conversations with our customers, I know they've been focused on all three of those aspects of the, the security kind of triad, cybersecurity triad. Just speaking to availability, the sheer number of DDoS attacks that we saw over the, it just kind of we predicted that there would be a ramp, and there absolutely was. And we closed out the year with over 10 million DDoS attacks observed by our networks, across our customers. And this has had a transformational effect on networks everywhere.
Excellent. Mark?
Yeah, we experienced quite a few things, as Hardik was saying, from that month of March over a year ago, where customers began experiencing immediately the need to shift not just a part of the workforce, but the entire workforce to some other kind of acceptable networking connectivity. And those impacts on the infrastructure were so diverse and so separating in the way the applications were being connected and the way the users were utilizing them, became so many unknowns, as well as the IT infrastructure being impacted by the sheer peaks of the way that they had to come in, whether it be their routing infrastructure, the firewalls suffering, or their VPN concentrators. Dealing with that remote workforce became such an impact. And what we started seeing was that we were never going to come back from this. And people needed to understand those manual processes. If it was change process or policy changes, they were unable to sustain the number of problems that they were incurring. And as we started helping our customers through this, what we began to see, and even in the articles that were written by us to a variety of trades, showed that everybody was having to go back to a single source of truth to be able to troubleshoot from both sides of the organization, whether it be the NetOps or the SecOps, being able to troubleshoot and derive what the impacts were and how to address them quickly was almost something that they hadn't experienced before. The way the scale came, the way the sheer numbers were pushing the networks to their extremes, and having to shift with that digital transformation to the public cloud, or to be able to just deal with their current infrastructure or add to that. So I think that there were many impacts from so many different arrays that customers had to shift everything that they were doing into more automation, more scalability, and to make sure that their fundamentals were still being held to the same level of constructive impact capabilities. Like Hardik just said, the having that CIA to make sure that they still could maintain security operations was almost an undefinable capability. And the shift has helped them grow. The others have suffered quite a bit, but they're starting to come back. As we said, we're coming out of it, and you're now seeing an investment in the infrastructure from both SecOps and NetOps.
Great. So you touched upon something, saying that there was sort of a common need, right, in this rush to deploy without sort of the pre-testing that normally goes with this. There was this common need to resort back to network visibility. Network visibility became a really, really important thing for both NetOps and service assurance and SecOps from cybersecurity, right? And they were going to this single source, trying to go to this single source of data, because a lot of times you weren't sure where the problem was, right? It was kind of like finger pointing. Well, it's a network application, or no, it's actually the result of a cybersecurity issue or something like that. So tell us a little bit more, Mark, about that use of that common data, that network-derived data for both NetOps and SecOps collaboration.
Yeah, there were a multitude of things that happened in there, whether they're NetOps and SecOps were utilizing that same source or even the same types of sources, maybe NetFlow on one side and maybe packet derived on the other side. And it's real easy for an IT person to say, okay, I've seen my problem, if you will, and come to a conclusion based on what their source data is. And the same thing from the SecOps side. And if the two don't have the same formulated data pattern or the collection capabilities or the depth of visibility, or even the point of visibility in their network or the telemetry, then they're going to derive different answers to the same questions. So we saw a lot of that crossfire going on, which duplicates the effort. I mean, if both sides are troubleshooting the same problem in the network, yet one is looking at it from their lens and the other is looking at it from their lens, those derived answers are going to be different. So they quickly began to see the need for that cohesive source or the single source of truth that they could all point to that allowed for that network data to be the single source of truth, as well as the ability for those endpoint data to be obfuscated or dealt with in other ways from the attacker's point of view. They were able to change things or manipulate it from the endpoints. So that network packet data has a common theme for all that went on in the last year. And we saw that from both our customers and from a lot of the network exposure that we're seeing. Yeah.
Excellent. So Hardik, visibility, we're talking about visibility, your network visibility, but the security teams have many different methods to derive visibility, right? Tell us a little bit about some of the additional ways they derive visibility for cybersecurity purposes. And then we'll talk about that, compare and contrast those with network visibility.
Yeah, no, so ultimately you want to know what is happening in your enterprise. And this is across the board. And so, for traditionally security has relied on like some form of like passive logging. So let's say your firewall is kind of generating logs and your VPN is generating logs, and you go consume those and try to derive security outcomes as a result. The past 10 years has led to, other forms of innovation, like say endpoint detection response kind of technologies, in which you are actually generating logs with the specific purpose of kind of fueling the security practice within an enterprise or an organization. So now, you have all of these various forms of essentially like logging and monitoring that often will converge in something like a SIEM, and then that might be your common interface into it. I'll say that like the sheer amount of information, of data that's being generated off of activities within the enterprise is now actually growing to a point where there's so many other solutions that are being applied. So it's just like the use of like big data technologies, creating a data lake for all of your, the logs and other forms of data that you may have gathered to then enable other kind of security outcomes.
So let's talk about it. You mentioned the endpoint. Mark mentioned a little bit about sort of malware getting more sophisticated and sensing that it's on a device that has anti-malware, antivirus running. Talk a little bit more about
mhm.
that and how that represents challenges on some endpoint solutions.
Yeah, I mean, so look at any major kind of certainly malware family, major campaign that we may have kind of heard of over the past few years, and you will see that the adversary is thinking about basically what are thought of as like anti-detection kind of techniques, evasion techniques, in which like hey I might behave in a certain way. If I sense the presence of a particular kind of like endpoint solution. So now I'm looking for, pick your favorite brand of endpoint solution. Now, all right, if it's present on the system, you know what? I'm just putting myself to sleep, and I'm not even going to touch it. Or I might take certain measures to see if I can, is it possible for me to disable Windows Defender, for example, and turn it off? In some cases there, I mean, certainly like, there from time to time, there's a vulnerability that's maybe understood inside one of these solutions. And now there are exploits that are specific to that kind of solution. I mean, just like, again, I mean, stepping outside of strictly of the endpoint kind of technology realm, I mean, among the biggest things that has happened or been reported on in the past year was the Sunburst campaign involving SolarWinds. Now, like, okay, here's a technology that ostensibly is brought into and deployed in the enterprise for a monitoring and maybe even a security purpose. And now that whole kind of apparatus was exploited for the purposes of the adversary's kind of campaign, and to establish a foothold and use as a propagation point. So these technologies, like, and coming back to endpoint technologies, even as they are effective and valuable, it's there's still, for any such technology that's deployed, the adversary is going to be looked for ways to either bypass or even better co-opt that technology in for the purposes of their campaign.
Great. So let's come back to, let's say they successfully were hiding their tracks on the endpoint, right? And as we were saying in the beginning, people were coming back to the network, the network derived data source, and saying, all right, well, they can't really hide their tracks on the network, right? What are some of the other advantages of using network derived data for security purposes?
Yeah, so let me touch on a few, and then kind of see if Mark wants to add to this. But then basically, from a look, the main thing is the malware, the adversary is present on the endpoint. So there's this, somebody I know described this as contested territory. Like if you have an agent and you're up against the adversary, you're both operating in the same space. And so now, like, that again has value, but also has like disadvantages. So that's one. From a network standpoint, it lets you kind of step out of that. So you're not worried about like the adversary overriding your logs or disabling your endpoint solution, because you know what, you're not even looking on the endpoint. Just separate from that, like in any sufficiently large enterprise will tell you that they don't know about all of their endpoints. So it's actually knowing that you have like complete coverage with your EDR solution in itself is a challenge. Then you take another few steps, and now like malware over the last certainly few years, there have been ones that target the BIOS. They're certainly like have for a long time they've been the malware that kind of is staged or is sitting on, say, other devices that are on your enterprise, including like IoT devices, where it is increasingly difficult to deploy like EDR solutions. You might have a giant Kubernetes kind of container farm. You might be using Lambdas in your AWS infrastructure, and these are not these serverless infrastructures are there's no persistence there. You're not going to put EDR type technologies over there. So all of these become points of contention that stepping outside of that and using the network to get that visibility kind of just helps you overcome these obstacles. Mark, do you see it the same way? Like, is that your observation?
Yes, so the
too?
visibility points are a point of contention in all deployments of architecture, and certainly having that defense in depth and covering as many of the angles as you can brings a better security posture. That being said, the only place that you can manipulate those log files is on the endpoints, and cover your tracks is on the endpoints. The network-derived data is hard to manipulate and hard to obfuscate. The only place that you could really deal with it would be to run crypto. And again, there's decryption. So on the network, it usually gives you that better point of truth, as long as your collection points or your visibility points have the coverage that you need. So whether it be choke points or diversity, in your spine leaf architecture, as long as you have that visibility, you stand a better chance of not having something hidden, removed, or manipulated in a much clearer way and a better way.
All right, so Mark, I'm kind of put you in a spot here a little bit and say, describe how a network analyst or a security analyst would leverage the network data once they figure out they've come to a roadblock, they've come to the end of the road on the endpoint. So to give us a sort of a day in the life here, our workflow, how that would actually work.
Yeah, I think we did a pretty good job of that back at Engage, in showing our customer base how we utilize that with some of our equipment, our solutions around Omnis Security. And typically you're going to see a SIEM or some kind of product that is utilizing the components, like Hardik had said, whether it be data lake or some large storage capacity, and be able to correlate that data across a large data set. So many people are writing now that the SIEMs and the SOARs are being challenged by new reference architecture and new solutions, but they're still foundational to what people have to use today to be able to get that correlation experience. Whether it's a new name or a new design, okay, so be it. But taking that information from, let's say, a SIEM at this point, just to keep it simple, and being able to go after the data set. Now, that's different than saying, I have an endpoint reporting or I have a network reporting. You're going after a data set or an event or a set of events. It could be a list of events, because many are tying the newer DRs to things like MITRE or Defense or Defend, different reference capabilities to what the SIEM data is reporting or the data lake is reporting. And to be able to go after that and drill into the exposed event, meaning that, for instance, in our Omnis Cyber Investigator, we have the ability to look in an event, open up a host investigation on the network side of things, referencing IP addresses, for instance, and be able to look at all the associated traffic related to that host within the entire network infrastructure. So it begins to look more like threat hunting, if you will. And again, there's conversations going on about SIEM, SOAR, and threat hunting as a conversation right now, because the changes in that dynamic is exactly what we're talking about. Being able to get to the information like we do in our network-derived data, taking that metadata and being able to turn it or pivot to the appropriate actions that you're looking for, and whether it be the applications or the security infrastructure, all together in one single lens, brings together naturally that NetOps and SecOps, from packets to security events to application level awareness. Whether it be level 3, layer 3 up to layer 7, you're going to need that visibility across the entire network infrastructure. And I think that gets us to the end, or the resolve, for a security analyst much quicker and much more resolved, by being able to look at it in a larger scope, all the way into layer 7 from the derived metadata. It's much more aware, and it's much more natural. And I think what we're seeing from our customer base, that they like the fact that they can cross that chasm much more quickly.
Excellent. Great. Well, that's all we have for today's panel. I'd like to thank both Mark and Hardik for their participation today. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this session. With that said, have a great day.
Thanks for watching this installment of On Guard, presented by NetScout, Guardians of the Connected World.